So now that we've talked about the first courts and the basic idea of juvenile courts, we'll talk now about the different decisions that have created the framework of due process, and due process means the legal protections that are in place for the defendant in court. Prior to the 1960s, the juvenile courts were completely informal and didn't follow any of the regular standards of process that had been in place for many years in adult court. Changes occurred in the 1960s, which of course that period of time is what is known as the Warren Court era, where criminal defense rights were advanced via the United States Supreme Court. The first of these seminal cases in juvenile court was the Kent case, which stated that even when a child was brought into juvenile court, and even when the purpose of the court was parens patriae, because the youth could be removed from the home for an extended period of time, and even subject to criminal liability or criminal sentences and sanctions, then they would still be guaranteed due process of law in juvenile court. This meant that certain basic things had to be provided for the child in court in the way of process. At issue here in the Kent case was whether the juvenile court needed to do a full investigation of the case and properly determine that the youth, Mr. Kent, should have been waived to adult court. Now, just FYI, the Kent case involved allegations that the youth was involved in a robbery and a rape, and he was waived to adult court without a hearing, and eventually convicted and sentenced to 30 to 90 years in prison. When this case was heard in the United States Supreme Court, the court found that Kent had not been given a hearing in juvenile court, had not been given access to an attorney, nor access to his record before he was waived to adult court. The U.S. Supreme Court wrote in their decision, quote, "Under our Constitution, the condition of being a boy does not justify a kangaroo court," unquote. In light of all this, the U.S. Supreme Court said the waiver of Kent to adult court was not valid. So Kent stands for the rule of law that juveniles are to be afforded due process and equal protection, i.e., basic standards of law have to be met, even when the process is deemed to be less formal in juvenile court. A year after Kent was decided, the U.S. Supreme Court then heard In re Galt, another juvenile case. Galt was accused of making obscene phone calls. Galt was eventually committed to the Arizona Boys School, and his commitment was challenged. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually heard the case and ruled that juveniles should be given the right to an attorney, the right to formal notification of the charges against them. They should be informed of their right against self-incrimination, i.e., meaning the right to be silent, and they should be allowed the right to confront their accusers, which is known as the right to confront witnesses or to cross-examine witnesses. These are all basic protections that are guaranteed to adults and must be given to juveniles, even though juvenile courts are deemed to be informal and the state takes on the role of parens patriae. More cases continue to be heard, including In re Winship in 1970, which ruled that the reasonable doubt standard, which would be applied in adult criminal proceedings, had to be applied in juvenile court proceedings. And then in 1971, the McIver case, which stated that jury trials are not constitutionally required. And be sure that it's correct in your course pack, because I think there's a typo in a previous year's course pack, and I'm not sure the publisher ever got that cleared up. So under McIver, it's clear that not all criminal protections are applied to juveniles that are in juvenile court. Juvenile law is also a highly evolving area of the law. Many significant decisions have come down in the past several decades. Notable out of Kentucky is the Stanford case, where Kevin Stanford was sentenced to death. He was 16 years old at the time of the offense, and this happened in Jefferson County, Kentucky. His case was eventually heard at the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court held that a 16-year-old youth could be subject to the death penalty. The year before this case, the U.S. Supreme Court held in Thompson v. Oklahoma that 15-year-olds could not be subject to the death penalty. So there's a bright line rule at this point in time that's being made between 15 and 16-year-old youths. However, years later, in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court heard another juvenile death penalty case, Roper, and ruled that the death penalty, as applied to juveniles, violated the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. This meant that juveniles in the United States could no longer be put to death as a sentence. It's worth noting that until Roper was decided in 2005, the U.S. was the only industrialized nation that allowed the death penalty for juveniles. Then in 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court heard the Graham case, which ruled that in a non-homicide case, that the states could not sentence a youth to life without parole. And then 2 years later, in 2012, the United States Supreme Court decided Miller, which ruled that a youth could not be subjected to mandatory life without parole sentences even in a homicide case. So this means in Miller that if a state had a law that made it mandatory for a sentence of life without parole to be imposed, that the jury had to be allowed to hear evidence and consider a non-life without parole sentence. That didn't mean that the jury couldn't impose life without parole, just that they had to be given the opportunity to consider a lesser sentence too. So the gist of all this is that juvenile law is evolving in many ways. The next slide gives you a timeline of decisions, including a few more in addition to the ones that we've just discussed. So the main ones regarding constitutionality and those constitutional protections are on the left side of the screen during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And the more recent ones regarding the harsh sentences such as the death penalty and life without parole sentences, these have happened in the past decade on the right side of the slide.